In the year 1901, the 8 foreign powers that had crushed China's Boxer Rebellion the previous year gathered in Beijing to sign a treaty. The Boxer Protocol, signed September 7, 1901, did not end a war. It institutionalized a punishment. But to understand why this treaty mattered more than the battles that preceded it, you must understand what happens when empires stop fighting and start administering. The Eight-Nation Alliance had defeated the Boxers and occupied Beijing in August 1900. By January 1901, organized resistance had collapsed. The Qing government, with Empress Dowager Cixi still in exile in Xi'an, sent envoys to negotiate. But the foreign powers were not interested in negotiating. They were interested in ensuring China could never challenge foreign control again. The terms they demanded were designed not to restore order, but to guarantee subordination. China would pay an indemnity of 450 million taels of silver, approximately $333 million in 1901 currency, over 39 years at 4% annual interest. The final payment would exceed 980 million taels. This sum was not arbitrary. It was calculated as 1 tael per person in China's estimated population of 450 million. The symbolism was deliberate. Every Chinese person owed the foreign powers for the crime of resisting foreign domination. The indemnity exceeded China's total annual government revenue. To guarantee payment, foreign powers took control of China's customs revenues and salt tax, the empire's most reliable income sources. When you seize a government's revenue streams, you do not merely extract money. You eliminate the government's capacity to function independently. The Qing could not invest in military modernization, infrastructure, education, or economic development without foreign permission. Every decision required calculating how much revenue could be diverted from indemnity payments. The protocol granted foreign powers the right to station permanent military garrisons in Beijing's legation quarter. This was unprecedented. For centuries, foreign envoys in China operated under Chinese authority. Now, foreign troops occupied the capital as a permanent presence. The legation quarter became a fortified foreign zone where Chinese law did not apply and Chinese citizens could not reside. Foreign troops could make the area defensible, meaning they could build fortifications, install artillery, and maintain military infrastructure in the heart of China's capital. Foreign powers also received the right to occupy strategic points along the railway from Beijing to the sea, including Tianjin, Tangshan, and Qinhuangdao. This created a military corridor under foreign control connecting Beijing to foreign naval forces on the coast. If the Qing government ever challenged foreign interests again, foreign troops could march from their coastal bases to the capital within days. The protocol demanded destruction of Chinese forts at Taku and all fortifications between Beijing and the sea. China's coastal defenses, the infrastructure that might prevent future foreign invasions, were systematically demolished. The Qing could not rebuild these forts without foreign approval. The protocol required execution or exile of officials who had supported the Boxers. Qing military commanders, provincial governors, and court officials who had resisted foreign demands faced capital punishment or permanent exile. This was not justice, it was elimination of anyone within the Qing government who might organize future resistance. The Qing was forced to erect monuments to the foreign diplomats killed during the Boxer crisis. Prince Chun traveled to Germany to apologize for the murder of German minister Clemens von Ketteler. An arch was built at the exact location where von Ketteler was shot, bearing an inscription in German, English, and Chinese expressing China's regret. These monuments stood as permanent reminders that challenging foreign power resulted in national humiliation. The Boxer Protocol was more dangerous than the Boxer Rebellion itself. Military defeats can be temporary. Treaties create legal frameworks that persist for decades. The protocol established that China existed in a state of permanent subordination. Foreign troops garrisoned in the capital, foreign banks controlling revenue, foreign powers dictating which Chinese officials could hold office. But the protocol also set in motion forces that would destroy the Qing dynasty. Chinese intellectuals and military officers watched as their government signed away sovereignty to maintain power. The question became unavoidable. If the Qing cannot protect China from foreign domination, why should China protect the Qing? The New Policies Reform movement began in 1901 as a direct response to the Boxer humiliation. The Qing attempted to modernize the military, reform education, and restructure administration. But reforms launched from a position of defeat and foreign supervision convinced many Chinese that reform was insufficient. Only revolution could restore Chinese sovereignty. While other foreign powers withdrew troops from Beijing throughout 1901, Russia maintained 170,000 soldiers in Manchuria. Russia claimed temporary occupation to protect its railway investments and restore order. Agreements were signed promising gradual withdrawal, but Russian troops did not withdraw. Manchuria's position, bordering Russian Siberia and Korea, and controlling access to warm water ports, made it too strategically valuable. Every month Russian forces remained. They built more infrastructure, established deeper administrative control, and integrated Manchuria into Russian strategic planning. Japan watched this occupation with growing alarm. Japan had fought China in 1895 specifically to prevent any single power from dominating Korea and Manchuria. Now, Russia occupied Manchuria with the largest military force in East Asia, positioned to move south into Korea at any time. By late 1901, Japanese military planners were no longer asking if war with Russia was necessary. They were asking when Japan would be ready to fight. The Boxer Protocol's failure to address Russia's Manchurian occupation set a 3-year countdown toward the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. While diplomats signed treaties in Beijing, British soldiers in South Africa faced a problem that conventional military victory could not solve. By January 1901, Britain controlled every major Boer city. The Orange Free State and South African Republic had been formally annexed. By traditional measures, Britain had won. But Boer commandos refused to accept defeat. Small mobile units of 50 to 100 mounted men attacked British supply lines, destroyed railways, ambushed patrols, and disappeared into the vast South African veld before British forces could respond. This was not a war for territory anymore. It was a war of endurance. Field Marshal Kitchener faced a strategic calculation with only one solution. Guerrillas require civilian support to survive. This includes food, intelligence, shelter, and medical care. Remove the civilian population from the countryside, and guerrillas cannot sustain operations. The policy Kitchener implemented was systematic. British columns swept through Boer territories, burning farms, destroying crops, slaughtering livestock, and poisoning wells. Any infrastructure that could support guerrilla operations was eliminated. Boer families, including women, children, and elderly men, were forcibly removed to concentration camps. The camps were not designed as death camps. They were designed as population control. But Britain had no capacity to administer camps for over 100,000 people. Overcrowding, inadequate food, contaminated water, and epidemic disease created mortality rates that shocked even Britain's own observers. Emily Hobhouse, an English social worker with the South African Women and Children Distress Fund, visited camps in the Orange Free State in January 1901. What she found destroyed any pretense that the camp served humanitarian purposes. At Bloemfontein, nearly 2,000 people lived in a camp designed for far fewer. Families slept without blankets in inadequate tents. Rations provided 1,500 calories daily, insufficient for adults doing physical labor, let alone growing children. Water supplies were contaminated. No soap was provided for laundry or bathing. Hospitals were overcrowded, understaffed, and lacked basic medicines. Children died in staggering numbers. Measles, typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia swept through camps where malnutrition weakened immune systems and overcrowding guaranteed transmission. By mid-1901, death rates in some camps exceeded 300 per 1,000 annually, mortality rates higher than medieval plague outbreaks. Hobhouse's report, published in June 1901, detailed conditions with devastating precision. She described children too weak to stand, mothers watching multiple children die within days, bodies buried in mass graves because individual funerals were impossible given the death rate. Liberal Member of Parliament David Lloyd George accused the government of a policy of extermination. Liberal leader Henry Campbell Bannerman delivered a speech condemning Britain's methods of barbarism. Public outrage forced the government to respond. The Fawcett Commission, an all-female investigative team led by suffrage leader Millicent Fawcett, toured camps from August to December 1901. Despite Fawcett's pro-government political stance, the commission confirmed everything Hobhouse had reported and demanded immediate reforms. These included increased rations, additional nurses, improved sanitation, and better shelter. By late 1901, the British government implemented reforms that reduced mortality rates, but the damage to Britain's international reputation was irreversible. The same empire that claimed to fight for civilization against barbarism had created camps where over a quarter of inmates died. The final death toll exceeded 28,000 Boer civilians, mostly women and children. Additional black African civilians in separate camps brought total civilian deaths to over 40,000. These deaths occurred not in combat but under British administration. Britain's South African campaign cost over £200 million, approximately 3 years of total government revenue. For this expenditure, Britain gained control of 2 small agricultural republics and international condemnation. But the deeper cost was strategic. Every pound spent in South Africa was unavailable for naval construction. Every soldier deployed against Boer guerrillas was unavailable for service in India, Egypt, or defending British coasts against German naval expansion. The Boer War demonstrated that Britain could defeat any enemy, but could not afford to do so repeatedly. This fiscal reality drove British policy in every other colonial territory throughout 1901. Administrative efficiency became the imperial priority. Britain could not afford another South Africa. The Boer War created vulnerabilities Britain could not ignore. With over 200,000 troops committed to South Africa, British garrisons in West Africa were skeleton forces. If multiple rebellions erupted simultaneously, Britain lacked the resources to suppress them. The Arrow Confederacy controlled a trading network across southeast Nigeria that predated British colonialism. Based in Arochukwu, the Arrow dominated regional commerce, wielded religious authority through the Arochukwu Oracle, and maintained military power through alliances with Eranth, neighboring peoples. This made them dangerous. The Arrow represented an alternative center of power that could coordinate resistance across British colonial boundaries. While Britain was distracted in South Africa, the Arrow could organize a regional uprising that would require massive military intervention to suppress. Britain chose preemption. In November 1901, a multi-column British expedition launched a coordinated invasion of Arochukwu. 3 columns converged on the Arrow heartland from different directions, overwhelming defenses through superior firepower and coordination. By March 1902, British forces had captured Arochukwu, destroyed the Oracle Shrine, and executed Arrow leadership. The invasion was not about immediate military threat. It was about eliminating the organizational capacity for future resistance. With the Arrow network destroyed, Britain could extend indirect rule throughout southeast Nigeria. Local chiefs would govern under British supervision, colonial police would maintain order, and British administrators would extract revenue. This system required minimal military forces because it eliminated alternative authority structures before they could challenge British control. British Somaliland presented a different problem. Syed Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, called the Mad Mullah by British authorities, had built a dervish movement that combined religious authority with military organization. Since 1899, Dervish forces had raided British protected territories, attacked caravans, and challenged British authority. Colonel E. Swain led a British column into the interior in 1901 to crush the Dervish movement. The expedition was designed as a quick punitive raid, small forces, minimal supplies, rapid strike against Dervish bases, then withdrawal. But Dervish forces were not concentrated in fixed positions. They operated as mobile units across vast desert territories. They engaged British forces when a tactical advantage existed and withdrew when outmatched. Swain's column fought several skirmishes but failed to engage the main Dervish force in a decisive battle. The expedition withdrew, having demonstrated British military presence but having accomplished nothing strategically. The Dervish movement remained intact, Hassan's authority was undiminished, and British control over the interior was non-existent. This failure revealed the limits of light expeditionary warfare. Unlike concentrated urban populations that could be controlled through occupation or agricultural societies that could be isolated through camp systems, desert nomads required different military approaches. The British would launch additional expeditions in 1902, 1903, and 1904, all achieving tactical victories, but no strategic success. The eventual solution would require combined arms operations with air support, logistics networks for sustained operations, and administrative systems for managing nomadic populations. But in 1901, none of these capabilities existed. The first Somaliland expedition set a pattern of repeated military interventions, achieving nothing except demonstrating the inadequacy of British military methods. The Philippine-American War entered its third year in 1901 with American forces controlling cities and Filipinos controlling the countryside. General Arthur MacArthur commanded over 70,000 American troops deployed across thousands of islands, speaking hundreds of languages. Emilio Aguinaldo, president of the First Philippine Republic, had shifted to guerrilla warfare in November 1899 after conventional battles proved disastrous. By early 1901, Aguinaldo's location was unknown to American forces. He moved between hideouts in northern Luzon's mountains, coordinating resistance through couriers. On February 8, 1901, American forces intercepted a courier carrying correspondence revealing Aguinaldo's approximate location. Brigadier General Frederick Funston developed a plan that relied on deception. Filipino scouts loyal to the United States, Macabebe scouts from Pampanga, would pose as reinforcements sent to Aguinaldo. Funston and several American officers would pose as prisoners captured by these reinforcements. On March 23, 1901, the disguised force reached Aguinaldo's headquarters in Palanan, Isabela. When Aguinaldo's guards greeted the approaching column, the Macabebe scouts opened fire. Within minutes, Funston's men had overwhelmed Aguinaldo's bodyguards and captured the Philippine president. On April 1st, Aguinaldo swore allegiance to the United States at Malacanang Palace. On April 19th, he issued a proclamation urging Filipinos to lay down their arms and accept American authority. The capture did not end Filipino resistance. General Miguel Malvar and other commanders continued fighting. But Aguinaldo's surrender shattered the narrative of unified Filipino nationalism resisting American imperialism. If the president of the Philippine Republic accepted American authority, how could subordinate commanders claim to fight for Philippine sovereignty? Aguinaldo's proclamation gave Filipinos who wanted to end the war a nationalist justification for surrender. Resistance became fragmented. Regional commanders fought for local grievances rather than a unified nation fighting for independence. American authorities amplified this fragmentation. Surrendered Filipinos received amnesty and property restoration. Those who continued fighting faced scorched-earth campaigns. The choice became stark: surrender and rebuild, or fight and lose everything. On August 18, 1901, the United States government created the Philippine Constabulary, a paramilitary police force recruited from Filipinos and commanded by American officers. The constabulary's mission was maintaining order and suppressing remaining resistance. This solved America's fundamental strategic problem. Counterinsurgency requires sustained presence, local knowledge, and the ability to distinguish insurgents from civilians. American soldiers lacked all three. They could not speak local languages, did not understand local politics, and could not identify insurgents except through crude methods like destroying entire villages suspected of supporting resistance. Filipino constables could do what American soldiers could not. They patrolled their own provinces, gathered intelligence from local informants, identified resistance leaders, and suppressed dissent without requiring American military oversight. The constabulary became the instrument through which American control was maintained after American troops withdrew. The Spooner Amendment, signed March 2, 1901, formally transferred authority in the Philippines from military to civilian government. Military Governor Arthur MacArthur was replaced by William Howard Taft as civil governor on July 4, 1901. This transition did not end military operations. American troops continued counterinsurgency campaigns through 1902, but it signaled a strategic shift. The war had moved from conquest to administration. The goal was no longer defeating Filipino resistance, but creating administrative systems that made resistance futile. The constabulary was the key innovation. By recruiting Filipinos to suppress Filipino resistance, America offloaded counterinsurgency costs onto the colonial population itself. Future resistance would face Filipino police rather than American soldiers, making rebellion appear as internal disorder rather than anti-colonial resistance. While American soldiers fought in the Philippines, American diplomats secured the Caribbean. On March 2, 1901, Congress passed the Army Appropriations Bill with the Platt Amendment attached. The amendment defined the terms under which American troops would withdraw from Cuba. Cuba could not sign treaties with foreign powers that impaired Cuban independence. Cuba could not contract public debt beyond its revenue capacity. The United States reserved the right to intervene in Cuba for the preservation of Cuban independence and to maintain order. Cuba would lease or sell land to the United States for naval and coaling stations. The Cuban Constitutional Convention initially rejected these terms, but American officials made clear that rejection meant indefinite military occupation. On June 12, 1901, Cuba's Constitutional Convention accepted the Platt Amendment by a vote of 16 to 11, incorporating it word for word into Cuba's constitution. The amendment created a legal framework for permanent American dominance without formal annexation. Cuba was independent, but could not conduct independent foreign policy, could not incur debt without American approval, and faced American military intervention whenever the United States determined order was threatened. Guantanamo Bay became an American naval base under a lease agreement that continues to this day. The Platt Amendment would not be repealed until 1934, but its logic, American intervention rights in the Caribbean, defined United States Caribbean policy throughout the 20th century. On November 18, 1901, the United States and Britain signed the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty. The treaty gave the United States exclusive rights to build and operate a canal across Central America, either through Nicaragua or Panama. This treaty reversed the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 1850, which required joint Anglo-American control of any Central American canal. Britain's concession reflected strategic reality. Britain could not defend Caribbean interests against a hostile United States while simultaneously maintaining naval supremacy in Europe and protecting global shipping routes. For the United States, the treaty was essential. A canal would reduce the voyage from the Atlantic to the Pacific by over 8,000 miles, meaning American warships could move between coasts in weeks rather than months. This transformed American naval strategy from defending two separate coastlines to projecting power across two oceans from a single fleet. Combined with the Platt Amendment and Philippine bases, the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty completed America's strategic infrastructure for Pacific dominance. American warships based in Caribbean ports could transit a canal to reach Philippine waters within weeks. The entire Pacific became an American sphere of operations. On February 2, 1901, Congress passed the Army Reorganization Act, creating a separate artillery corps divided into field artillery and coast artillery. This reorganization addressed America's coastal defense problem. An empire requires naval bases, and bases require protection from naval bombardment. American ports, from Maine to Washington State, from Puerto Rico to the Philippines, needed artillery installations to deter enemy warships. The creation of a professional artillery corps standardized coastal defense across American territories. This infrastructure would prove essential within 15 years. When World War I began, American coastal defenses prevented German naval raids. When World War II began, American harbor defenses throughout the Pacific protected logistics networks essential for projecting power across Asia. The 1901 reorganization demonstrated that empire required not just expeditionary forces, but permanent infrastructure, fortifications, garrisons, logistics networks that could be sustained across decades. On September 6, 1901, President William McKinley attended the Pan-American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. While greeting visitors, anarchist Leon Czolgosz shot McKinley twice with a concealed revolver. McKinley died 8 days later on September 14, 1901. Theodore Roosevelt became president at age 42, the youngest president in American history. But Roosevelt's succession did not change American strategy. McKinley had authorized the Platt Amendment, supported the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, and overseen Philippine pacification. Roosevelt continued all three policies. If anything, Roosevelt accelerated American imperial ambitions. He would invoke the Platt Amendment to justify the 1906 occupation of Cuba. He would orchestrate Panama's independence from Colombia, specifically to secure canal rights. He would expand American naval power through a global cruise of the Great White Fleet. McKinley's assassination demonstrated that American imperialism did not depend on individual leadership. The strategic logic driving American expansion, Pacific bases, Caribbean dominance, canal control, had become institutional. Presidents might change, but the policies persisted. Sultan Abdul Hamid II's Hejaz Railway project entered its second year of construction in 1901. The railway from Damascus toward Medina represented the Ottoman strategy of control through connection. The project proceeded despite financial challenges. Muslim communities worldwide continued donating funds. Ottoman soldiers provided labor. German engineers supervised construction through harsh desert terrain. The railway's progress in 1901 was not measured in miles of track completed, but in the demonstration that the project would continue. Other empires watched nervously. A railway connecting Istanbul to Mecca meant Ottoman troops could move to Arabia within days rather than months. Tribal revolts that previously required months to suppress could be crushed within weeks. British officials in Egypt and the Persian Gulf recognized the threat. An Ottoman railway meant the Ottoman Empire could project power throughout Arabia, challenging British influence in the region. France worried that Ottoman infrastructure would reduce French commercial influence. Russia feared Ottoman military mobility might enable resistance to Russian advances in the Caucasus, but the railway also represented Ottoman vulnerability. The project required external engineering expertise, relied on donations from Muslims outside Ottoman control, and consumed resources the empire could not afford. Construction would continue through 1908, but the railway never extended beyond Medina. Saudi rebels would destroy sections during World War I, and the Ottoman Empire would collapse before the project reached Mecca. The railway's significance in 1901 was symbolic. The Ottoman Empire could still undertake ambitious projects without European loans, mobilizing religious solidarity rather than foreign capital. This made the empire's eventual collapse more shocking. When the Ottomans fell, they fell despite, demonstrating capacity for modernization. On May 28, 1901, William Knox D'Arcy, a British financier, secured a 60-year concession from the Persian government to explore for oil throughout most of Persia, modern-day Iran. The concession excluded only 5 northern provinces adjacent to Russia. D'Arcy paid £20,000 in cash, plus £20,000 in shares, and promised Persia 16% of annual profits. In 1901, this appeared to be a speculative investment with uncertain returns. Persian oil reserves were unproven. Extraction technology was primitive. Global oil demand was limited. But the concession's military significance would become clear within a decade. In 1908, D'Arcy's company discovered massive oil reserves at Masjed Soliman. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was founded. By 1911, the British Royal Navy began converting from coal to oil, making Persian oil a strategic necessity for British naval supremacy. The D'Arcy concession created a legal framework that would shape Middle Eastern geopolitics throughout the 20th century. Foreign companies extracting oil under agreements with weak local governments became the model for regional development. Revenue from oil transformed Persian politics, created incentives for foreign intervention, and made the Persian Gulf a permanent strategic interest for global powers. In 1901, none of this was obvious. The concession appeared to be a minor commercial transaction, but it established the principle that foreign powers could secure long-term rights to Persian resources through agreements with the Persian government, setting a precedent for the oil concessions, military bases, and intervention rights that would dominate the region's future. The logic of 1901 was institutionalizing last year's violence. Every major power in 1901 faced the same strategic problem that had driven policy in 1900: how to maintain control over existing territories when expansion was impossible and retreat invited predators. But where 1900 saw military responses, the Boxer intervention, the Boer offensive, American gold standard stability, 1901 saw administrative responses. The Boxer Protocol transformed military victory into financial extraction, garrison rights, and permanent oversight. The British concentration camp system transformed counter-insurgency into population control infrastructure that could be replicated elsewhere. The Philippine Constabulary transformed American military occupation into Filipino self-policing. The Platt Amendment transformed American military presence into legal intervention rights. These administrative solutions were more dangerous than the military campaigns that preceded them because they were designed to be permanent. Military occupations generate resistance and eventually end. Legal frameworks, financial obligations, and garrison rights persist for decades, creating resentment that accumulates until it explodes. Russia's Manchurian occupation in 1901 set a 3-year countdown to war with Japan. Britain's concentration camps created Boer nationalism that would persist through World War I and beyond. America's Philippine Constabulary created a colonial police state that would face resistance through the 1950s. The Platt Amendment created Cuban resentment that would culminate in the 1959 revolution. Most critically, the administrative solutions of 1901 required permanent military readiness to enforce. The Boxer Protocol meant foreign garrisons in Beijing indefinitely. The Platt Amendment meant American naval bases throughout the Caribbean. The Philippine Constabulary meant American officers commanding colonial police. British garrison reductions in South Africa meant shifting troops to India and the Middle East. Every empire in 1901 demonstrated it could institutionalize control through legal and administrative frameworks rather than permanent military occupation. But every framework required the threat of military force to maintain. Treaties only matter when powers are willing to enforce them. Administrative systems only function when resistance is systematically suppressed. Garrison rights only deter challenges when garrisons are sufficiently strong. The military history of 1901 was the year empires learned to rule through bureaucracy backed by violence. They created systems designed to make last year's coercion permanent, but permanence required readiness to repeat 1900s violence at any moment, and that readiness would lock these empires into arms races, alliance systems, and security anxieties that would produce World War I. The Boxer Protocol demonstrated that defeating China required not just victory, but decades of financial extraction. The Boer War demonstrated that defeating guerrillas required not just military superiority, but willingness to create concentration camps. The Philippine War demonstrated that defeating insurgency required recruiting colonized people to suppress their own resistance. The Platt Amendment demonstrated that controlling Cuba required not annexation, but intervention rights that could be invoked indefinitely. Each solution worked in the short term. By the end of 1901, China paid its indemnity. Boer resistance was failing. Filipino insurgency was fragmenting, and Cuba was subordinated. But each solution created long-term frictions that would intensify. 1901 was not the year empires secured their dominance. It was the year they locked themselves into systems that required permanent vigilance, permanent garrisons, permanent intervention, and permanent military readiness. The infrastructure of empire built in 1901 would become the infrastructure of World War I.